Welcome to the Cash Flow Academy podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner, and this is where we do our very, very best to make things simple for all of you. So, very exciting discussion today. We're going to talk a little history today, and my guest, very exciting, is Diana B. Henriques. And so, Diana B. Henriques, welcome to the program. Thanks for coming and
Thanks
visiting
for having
with us.
me, Andy. I'm delighted to join you.
You've written a couple of books. One, interesting, The Wizard of Lies. It was a book on Bernie Madoff and the deterioration, or in your words, the death of trust. And now you've got a book called Taming the Street, the Old Guard, the New Deal, and FDR's fight to regulate American capitalism. We're going to be speaking about this book, which I'm just a history guy, particularly with finance and regulation and policy. So I'm going to be like the kid in the candy store today, asking questions. But before we hop into your book, Diana, tell us a little bit about your background and what was it that brought you to have an interest in these topics?
Well, thank you, Andy. I share your passion for financial history. In fact, it's something that has driven my reporting as a New York Times reporter for many years. I used to joke with other reporters that you need to know the minutes of the last meeting. And financial history is, in fact, the minutes of the last meeting, the last time we had a market crash, the last time we had a recession, the last time the Fed was backed into a corner. And so I will admit that my passion for Wall Street history was perhaps initially born as a result of my delightful relationship with my late father-in-law. My husband's dad worked on Wall Street as a runner. You'll know what that is because you're a history buff. The little messenger guys carrying paper stacks of stocks from brokerage firm to brokerage firm back when he was 14 years old. So this would have been in the 20s. He was actually at Kidder Peabody during the 1929 crash. And he stayed on the street through the 30s and through the war. So his memories were just fascinating to me. And I started learning more about what I could share with him, reading books that I could share with him. And that really ignited my passion for this field of history. But also, I'm a bit of a contrarian. You are too, a little bit, I think. And it bothered me that so few people paid attention to financial history. That it was as if we woke up every morning with a brand new stock market that that had never existed before, and that just really drove me nuts. So when I first started covering Wall Street, I stumbled across a book called Once in Golconda by James Brooks, who was the extraordinary business writer for the New Yorker for many, many years before his death, and an idol of mine. And it was a simple little compendium of tales from Wall Street, 1920 to 1940. And it was episodic and it had lots of little bits and pieces. And every one of them I wanted to know more about. But the one I really wanted to know more about was the rise and fall of Richard Whitney, who was the president of the New York Stock Exchange during the early 30s and the days of the New Deal, and really led Wall Street's resistance to Roosevelt's reforms. He proudly called himself the head of the old guard. They called themselves the old guard at the time, so I borrowed that for my title. But John Brooks just whetted my appetite for the Whitney story, and the deeper I got into it, I learned that his nemesis at the SEC was William O. Douglas. Oh my gosh. Douglas was on the Supreme Court when I was in college. I mean, this was a throwback to the past. And then, who had hired Douglas? Whoa, Joe Kennedy had hired Douglas to work for the SEC. Well, how did that happen? Well, because Joe Kennedy was a New Dealer. Are you kidding me? So I just fell into this story loop about the origin days of Wall Street regulation in the aftermath of the Great Crash of 29, and of course at the nadir of the Great Depression. And as I studied more about it, I just was stunned how relevant every one of its lessons are for us today. So it's true that this is a history book. And frankly, I think it's a pretty lively history book. It's got incredible characters, and they were fighting an incredible fight. But it is also a primer for many of the issues that we're still facing today. We have not closed the books on the argument about deregulation versus regulation.
Yep.
That's still very active. We haven't, in fact, even closed the books on unregulated markets. Look at the crypto market today.
Yes.
An unregulated market that we're wrestling to try to bring into some kind of control because it's hurting retail investors. So these aren't closed books. These aren't issues that we settled back in the 30s and then went off and fought a war and had a great prosperity, and that was that. These are issues that we still wrestle with today in the political realm. And my fear, and part of the reason that motivated me to write this book, is we've come to take that New Deal legacy of Wall Street regulation so much for granted that we're not even going to know what we're going to lose if it's taken away. And it's under threat of being curtailed and taken away to this day. So that's what drove me to write the book. And as political events evolved, I just felt the book became more and more and more relevant. So I was delighted to finally get it done in spite of all the obstacles thrown in its path.
As a hunt and peck typist, and I suppose I've written a couple of books. I can empathize with the difficulty of authorship is not as easy as people think it is. But I'll tell you, it's a wonderful experience. I tell people, if you really want to learn something, don't read a book on something, write one, because it will force you to learn more about your topic than you ever would by reading one. So
that's absolutely true. The best advice I ever got about book writing was from the great author David McCulloch, who came to speak to
really?
At the New York Times. And we were quizzing him about his very first book, which was about the Jonestown flood. And how had he come to write that? I mean, it was just it seemed like a topic absolutely out of the blue, the great Jonestown flood of the early 20s. And he said, well, he was working as a clerk at the Library of Congress during the day while he was working on the great American novel at night, like every writer. And one day, a big box full of photographs came in, pictures, no description, just pictures that someone had saved and donated to the Library of Congress of the devastation of the Jonestown flood.
I'll be darned.
He's looking through these photographs. He's just blown away. He said, I got to read about this.
Yeah.
So he goes to the Library of Congress index and he looks for a book on the Jonestown flood, and there isn't one.
So he's okay.
He said, okay. He said, so his rule is write the book you want to read but can't find.
That's fantastic.
And so that sort of was what I did with this book, Andy. I wanted to read about how we originally brought Wall Street regulation into being, why it was important, what it took to do it. And although there are a gazillion biographies of FDR, they're on my bookshelf right up here beside me. You go through the index and you look up Securities and Exchange Commission, one of the key contributions to our financial security.
For sure.
And if there's 2 or 3 or 4 entries in the index, it's a lot. Because Roosevelt lived so long and was such a consequential president in the life of this country. And his financial reforms worked so well that by the time of his death in 1945, they were a given. They were almost taken for granted. Of course, bank deposits are insured by the FDIC. Well, they hadn't been before FDR, but they were now, and we took it for granted. Of course, there's a watchdog on Wall Street, the SEC. Well, there hadn't been before FDR, but there is now, and they took it for granted. So even in the obituaries for FDR that ran with his death in April of 1945, his financial reforms were barely mentioned. And yet, if you read the campaign speeches, If you read his speeches in the
Really?
first 2, 3, 4 years of his administration, financial reform was the heart and soul of the New Deal, as he
Well,
saw it.
yeah. And, one more nod to the broad strokes of history, and then we're going to get a little more granular. As a financial education advocate, my rhetorical goals are to get people learning, and to strike a chord with learning. And I'll just say that the experience of history, of understanding how important that is as you understand how something evolved, and these things are evolved, not designed necessarily. That they're a patchwork that is constant. It's like a home remodel with, I moved into my first home and it had 4 electrical boxes, and we said, all right, we got to clean this out and get one. And it is very patchwork. And if you dive into history and take that time, you'll have an incredible experience of epiphany where things like, so that's why this, where that is. But you'll also find just incredible. I'll give you an example. My big study is 401ks, and people say, where'd that come from? I go, well, there's a guy named Barbara Conable in upstate New York. He had constituents from Xerox and Kraft. ERISA had frozen bonuses for executives, and they asked for a favor. And he hired Richard Stanger, who was a 22-year-old lawyer, 23, right out of Temple University, I believe it was. And he wrote 1,000-word. It's less than 1,000 words, and said, hey, these guys are going to be able to take these bonuses. 2 years later, Ted Bennett says, oh, this would be a cool way to help my client. Next thing you know, you have a 401k. 20 years goes by. 20 years. And Barbara Conable's at a gathering, and his friends come up and says, congratulations. What? Well, according to this financial magazine, you've been nominated for Man of the Century. He says, what? He goes, well, you're the guy that did the 401k, right? And he goes, no. He calls up the Ways and Means Committee and said, did I have anything to do with 401k legislation? And they say, yeah, you sponsored it. He wrote a doorstop book on all of how to write regulation. No mention of the most important legislation he ever came up isn't mentioned in his doorstop book that could stop a train. And so these things are fascinating to say, how in the world does, and so understanding history and saying, well, there wasn't always a group of smart men and women that had your interest at heart. There were political winds that pull and sway, and the pendulum, and this is what we're really going to get into with your book, is the pendulum of free market. No, we want regulation, because there's this balance. And this is what I think is fascinating about what we're going to talk about, is on the one side, regulation puts the handcuffs on me. It makes things slow, blah, blah, blah. And on the other side, if you allow human beings to run wild, there will be a certain Madoff type personality in that population that unfortunately just everyone isn't trustworthy. I think Alan Greenspan really learned through the subprime meltdown that they're going to do things to CDOs, and they're going to mislabel things, and the almighty dollar will make guys do kind of nutty stuff. So
what surprised Greenspan was not that bankers were doing deceptive or
the amount of risk they've took.
Self-protective things. What surprised him was that they were doing things that would bring themselves down.
It was the risk they took.
The unwitting self-destruction.
Exactly. The irrational exuberance.
That he couldn't believe that at some point they're not say, wait, but this is going to hurt us. We can't do this.
Yeah.
And yet that is the story of human nature. And that is the story that dominated Wall Street through much of its history up until it came face to face with
that's a great comment, because he's like, these guys are smart guys. They're not going to take more risk than they should. It wasn't that they were nefarious. It was that they were greedy, and they got crazy with the amount of leverage and the amount of exposure they had. So let's hop into your
Yeah,
book.
let's go back to the pre-New Deal days, because I think it's instructive to learn, and I devote the preface of my book to explaining what life was like when Roosevelt and Joe Kennedy and Bill Douglas were coming of age, when they were, becoming young men, starting their families, starting their savings accounts. Of course, well, Roosevelt was quite wealthy. Joe Kennedy made his fortune on his own. Bill Douglas was hard scrabble poor. So, each of them was coming towards capitalism from a different approach, but the capitalism they saw was the capitalism of Calvin Coolidge. They were looking at the 1920s. Now, Hollywood loves the 1920s, the jazz age, the roaring
Great Gatsby.
20s.
Great Gatsby.
The Great Gatsby, fabulous fashions, wonderful cars, all of that.
Yeah. Art
But
Deco.
in fact, yes, for the average investor, for the average ordinary American saver, they were a jungle, an absolute jungle. They were unsafe for man or beast. The financial landscape of the 1920s was dominated by the most powerful plutocrats and utterly untouched by government regulation. And if government decided it was going to do something, that government would quickly be told the opposite. The decade of the 20s was one in which the preferences and the priorities of the 1% of the most powerful, richest Americans governed the economy to a degree that we can't even quite take in today. So I wanted to let people initially know that that's what it looked like beforehand. And what do I mean? Well, stocks and bonds were sold with completely bogus information to unsophisticated investors.
Yeah.
Stock prices were routinely manipulated by the big insiders at the New York Stock Exchange and in other marketplaces, so that you had no idea whether this was a genuine rally in the stock you just bought or a complete paper trail, just painting the tape to make it look like it was a hot stock and to pull the suckers in, at which point maybe they'd bribe a couple of financial journalists to write the stories that they needed to sell. That was done. There were canceled checks that proved that those bribes were given and taken. And then they would dump the stocks out on the public, and you'd be left holding the bag with a stock that would never see that price again in your lifetime. There were stocks that were toys of the manipulators. They would almost toss them back and forth like puppy toys. So it was a world where the stock market was called a casino, but it was worse than the casino. A casino has rules. A casino basically has you can't tilt the roulette wheel without getting caught at some point. But the world of Wall Street in the 1920s, while it had rules on paper, they were enforced by gentlemen investors who looked out for each other. They didn't really want to cause any trouble for their friends. And it was their friends who were breaking the rules, and they were the people who were supposed to enforce the rules. So what happened at the New York Stock Exchange, and in smaller scale at the 100+ stock exchanges across the country in those days, was it became a private club. Maybe some guy ripped off a public investor and you slap him on the wrist because he's such a nice guy. He came to your daughter's debutante party. He's part of the club. You play golf with him every Wednesday. You can't really come down like a ton of bricks on him for breaking the rules. So that was the way the world worked, and everybody knew that was the way the world worked, and everybody thought that was the way the world would always work. And then came October of 1929.
Yeah.
And the worst crash that anybody had ever seen, could ever remember in the history of Wall Street occurred. And while it's not, you can't draw a direct line from the market crash to the Great Depression. I call it a prelude to the Great Depression, because one thing we know it did was shake public confidence to a shocking degree.
Huge.
And the other thing we know it did was almost overnight constrict spending. Consumer spending started to dry up from the top down. Yes, the people who've been feeling very rich for a decade all of a sudden felt very poor. And so, the fur salons on the Miracle Mile in Chicago and the jewelry shops and in Manhattan started to
Just
see
contraction.
But that contraction trickled down. That they laid off their household help. The household help had to cut back on their budgets and could no longer order the groceries or do the dry cleaning that they had been able to do. So they start washing their own laundry and making things stretchable. So the grocery stores and the dry cleaners start to suffer. And in an amazingly rapid period of time, that constriction in consumer spending starts to really damage the overall economy in a way that economists at the time did not think would happen. They thought a stock market crash would just hurt the big rich guys, their wives and girlfriends would get less jewelry for Christmas, and that would be the big outfall. But although the market recovered, kind of a dead cat bounce into the spring of 1930, at that point it turned, and as you know, I know you because you know your history, it began to fall from April of 1930 and fell solidly until July of 1932, by which point it had wiped out almost 90% of its value before the 29 crash. So it was a devastating crash. And by that point, by July of 32, of course, we were shoulder deep in a depression that was tearing the country apart.
The unemployment was an interesting thing. The Federal Reserve, they go to Jekyll Island and they decide to, make this quasi-government, quasi-privately owned, bank-owned institution, which if people want to decry the Fed and the Fed, well, go to the 1800s and look at the wildcat banks and look at the currencies of those times where they take a barrel of specie and fill it full of rocks and cover the top with silver. Say, look what we got, right? So
right.
It is even worse in the wild West. But as you look at the Fed today and they look at that crash, to a man and a woman, the whole group is like the Fed should have inflated the economy. They should have devalued that currency. It got the value of a dollar soared. They were so scarce. The money supply was so tight. People were shoving stuff under their mattress. It wasn't moving. The velocity of money, which is as important as the money supply, exactly. It's just people went no money, and it just stopped.
If you've got any, you hang on to it.
Yeah. So
and if you don't have any, you can't get any.
Which is so important historically. I'd like to insert this, if I may, is, my grandfather comes over from Germany. He's born in 1903, and he comes over as a young kid. And I remember sitting on his knee when I'm 3 years old, and he's going crazy in 1971 when we go off the gold standard. I mean, he's going nuts. He knows his parents are telling him about the Weimar Republic, his wheelbarrows full of cash, no. And so these guys had a culture because of that history of saving. Now you're crazy to save money. You're nuts to save money. Why would you buy something where there's a policy that says we're going to take 2.5% out of that if we can every single year for the next 30 years? So understanding that ebb and flow of contractions like the Depression, high unemployment, and then just we're going to spend, we're going to invent, $8 trillion during COVID. But crazy difference.
But what's fascinating to me, Andy, and I don't know if you share this, Mr. Breed, but what's fascinating to me is the inflationary horror stories, like the Weimar. Like the 1970s in the United States. It was nothing like Weimar, but of course we all scared ourselves to death that it was the Weimar Republic return in the 1970s. The inflationary horror stories seem to stick in our brains much more indelibly than the deflationary horror stories. And that's because we don't make the connection. The Great Depression was a deflationary horror story. It lasted for 3 years.
For sure.
That was deflation. Okay, I understand you're afraid of inflation, Mr. America. I got that. I understand
Yeah.
you're afraid of what inflation can do. Have you thought about what deflation will do?
Well,
And
as an
that's,
investor,
yeah,
as an investor, I look at my grandfather. I mean, on my dad's side, they were eating dandelions. I mean, they were eating dandelions. They remember this time.
this was not
The
unusual. My
poverty.
family was in the coal fields of West Virginia. My dad's
Oh
father
my
were tenant
goodness.
farmers in Arkansas. And apart from the East Coast was feeling the starvation. There literally were people living in caves in Central Park. We have photographs of people in middle-class suits, men in suits and vests, climbing over landfills in Chicago, scavenging for whatever they could find that could be used or could be sold. So it was a time of desperate suffering in the United States. But out in the heartland where my family was from, it was not only a time of desperate suffering, it was a time where the political fabric was ripping apart.
Yeah.
There were farmers who were going on strike, holding their food back from the market to try to get higher prices. There were foreclosure agents who were being threatened with lynchings when they came to try to foreclose on a property for a bank. There was an enormous rise in radical activity on the left and on the right. We'd seen, the American wealthy had seen Benito Mussolini in Italy for almost a decade, turning Italy's economy around. How? Of course, by suppressing labor unions, by suppressing civil rights, by using absolute tyranny. But hey, the economy worked beautifully. And so a lot of wealthy Americans were looking at both Italy and Germany, where labor unions were being brutally suppressed by Hitler, and saying, it's these workers who are our problems. Maybe we need to try that. So it was not only a time of physical suffering in the US, which it was, but it was also a time of ideological
very much
ideological chaos, where people were unsure that democracy could work anymore to pull them out of this mass of suffering. There was a wonderful quote by FDR that Jonathan Alter mentioned in his book, The Defining Moment. A visitor came to the White House right after FDR had been sworn in probably the bleakest days ever. I'd love to talk about that week of the swearing in 1933. But he said to Roosevelt, if you can cure this depression, you'll be our greatest president ever. But if you fail, you'll be our worst president. And Roosevelt corrected him. And he said, no, if I fail, I'll be our last president.
Yeah.
He felt
Great line.
sure that the democratic experiment could not survive if it did not bring relief to the American public after 3 years of suffering. And so that was his compelling drive. And it's interesting to me, quite moving to me, given that I love financial history, that given that compassion, that sense of a suffering nation, one of the things he thought would help most was reforming finance.
Yeah.
Making finance fairer and safer for Americans. He felt that was fundamental to persuading them that democracy was on their side, that democracy could give them a better life if they would just trust it a little further and let him turn this depression around. So that mix, that almost that joined at the hip concept between economic fairness and healthy democracy was something that FDR saw immediately, and it drove his policies. And it's one of the things I think we're still wrestling with today. We're worried about the health of our democratic institutions. Well, have you looked at the health of our economy? How fair does our economy seem to the average American today? And if it felt fairer to them, would our democratic institutions be in as much trouble? as they are, because it's instructive to understand how close, from Roosevelt's perspective, how close America came to just cracking apart over the Great Depression. It wasn't just hard times. It was hard times that were becoming increasingly intolerable for the American voter. And that, of course, carried FDR into office in the 1932 election, the overwhelming majority, although not as big a majority as he got in 1936. After he pursued the New Deal for 4 years, he got even more support. But when he came to office, in those days, Andy, as you know, there was a long interregnum between the election and the inauguration. This was the last time we inaugurated our president in March of 1933. Thereafter, of course, we reverted by constitutional amendment to the January date that we follow today. But in that last interregnum of that length, you had 6 months almost between this overwhelming victory for the New Deal and when the New Dealer was going to be sworn in. And in those 6 months, the country nearly fell apart. The banks were subject to run after run, panic after panic. Gold was flowing out of the country. Roosevelt himself narrowly survived an assassination attempt in February of 33. By the end of February, all banks started to close, starting with Nevada and then Michigan. State governors began to close their banks or sharply restrict withdrawals from the banks. The last banks standing were the New York City banks, the giant banks of New York City, and they were still open the day before Inauguration Day. But during the night, the New York Fed begged Governor Lehman in New York to shut the banks because they were subject to such desperate runs. And so during the night at 3 a.m. in the morning, those banks were shut. So when FDR goes to the Capitol to put his hand on this family's Dutch Bible that was 100 years older than the Constitution, and swore him in, there wasn't a functional banking system in the United States. There was not a state where the banks were functioning. And because the banks were closed, all of our markets were closed. The New York Stock Exchange closed that Saturday morning before the inauguration. Richard Whitney climbed up to the podium and announced that they were closed, and they had no idea when they would open again because they couldn't open until the banks opened.
Until the banks were open.
Again. And what happened after that, which I had great fun in describing in my book, was almost a miracle of legislation and executive leadership. Roosevelt got the banking crisis largely resolved in less than 10 days. 10 days. His nemesis, Herbert Hoover, who had lost to him in November, had been browbeating FDR all through this interregnum to repudiate the New Deal. He kept saying to Roosevelt and to the public and to everybody, people were afraid of the New Deal. That's why they're pulling their money out of the banks. They don't trust you, Roosevelt. They don't trust the New Deal. And Roosevelt said to himself, no, they don't trust the banks. That's why they're pulling their money out of the banks. They don't trust the banks.
And he just had a better, I mean, if you don't have a chicken in your pot and your campaign is to put a chicken in every pot, Joe Q. Public wants to vote for the chicken in the pot. True?
Well, yeah, I think it's usually true that Joe Public will vote his personal self-interest. But I think we've seen too many examples in the decades since the New Deal to believe that that's always the case, because we've seen people who really need the support of a strong federal safety net vote against it.
So and this brings up you've just brought up a really important point, and I'd like to get your take on this. And I have this terrible habit of commandeering conversations by inserting,
I'm fighting back again against that.
about inserting the idea of financial education. we never want to be a victim blamer, because that's just anyone who's been, for example, the Madoff victims, right? There is a school of thought that I think, okay, if I'm an investor and I'm seeing those kinds of returns, to me, I'm just like, there's just no way this is possible, right? I'm a smart enough guy to know that the returns I'm being told that guy wasn't missing, right? It's just like, this should have been noticed by someone long
okay,
before.
now I am going to intervene here, because that is one of the Madoff myths that I have been trying to push back against ever since I wrote The Wizard of Lies. The notion that for the bulk of investors, they were being offered something that sounded too good to be true. That's not true. There were a handful, by which I mean 4 or 5 very early investors of Madoff's, who were being offered outsized returns.
Yeah.
Returns pretty consistent with what they could have gotten at any private hedge fund at the day. Not what you or I could have gotten,
Yeah.
but the kind of returns that those big guys would have expected to get. But the vast majority of Madoff's investors were being offered returns that barely beat the market. One of the victims was an accountant, and he prepared for Congress and testified at a congressional hearing that over the years he held his Madoff investment, he would have made more money in the Magellan Fund at Fidelity.
Yeah.
Madoff was not selling huge returns.
Yeah.
He was selling safe, consistent returns to people who were not greedy, but who were frightened. So we need to make a distinction between who the victims were. Yes, there were greedy victims. Some of them, most of the large banks, private investors, but most of his victims were simply frightened.
I wouldn't argue that they were greedy. I think that'd be a mischaracterization of greedy. The larger point that I wanted to insert was the idea of why is there not a push for financial education throughout our country? As you look at history, we have said, okay, you have the greedy guys that are going to do nefarious things, but it would help a lot if we educated the public. You mentioned the thing that brought it up is you made a very good point. You said, well, Andy, many times those who would need something would not vote for that thing. To me, that is a clear indication of a lack of education in the electorate. In other words, if you have an electorate that is voting against what would be in their best interest, that's generally a function of ignorance. And that was really the larger point that I wanted to insert. I think
you're absolutely right about that larger point, Andy. And while I think that we desperately need education about financial literacy and financial history at a very early level, the sad fact is we're barely teaching American history at all.
Yeah.
And to say, okay, but I also want you to teach America's financial history too. The poor history teacher is going to roll her eyes and say, I'm struggling to be able to teach about Reconstruction. How exactly am I going to be able to teach financial history? And I understand that, but who I will not give a pass to is our political community and our media community.
Yeah.
You don't have to learn everything you learn in school. It would be great if you did. It would be glorious if people did learn more about financial literacy and financial history in school. But there are other ways to learn it. And
that's especially in our day and age, right?
Yes,
there's books,
absolutely.
There's books like yours you can read. There's podcasts
books like
to listen
yours
to.
that you can read.
There's
there
opportunities for those
who have an audience on their cell phone at any moment, and they can use that to educate the voters about what's being done, or
for not.
Yes.
I don't know if we live in the information age or the misinformation age. I don't know which one it is.
I think it's a continuing fight. It's a continuing fight. But if you look to FDR, and you'll forgive me if I keep going back to to talking up my own book, as they say on Wall Street. But if you look at FDR, he wasn't an ideologue. He was a pragmatist. He didn't subscribe to any one set of ironclad, never break these rule commandments. He was at that point when he became president ready to try anything that would work, because the nation's back was to the wall. He had to do something. So he tried, he experimented, he tried different things. But so he wasn't a great ideologue or even a great administrator. He was a magnificent communicator. And at every step along the way, he told the American public, here's what we need to do. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I've done. Here's what remains to be done. And through his fireside chats, which became famous, spoke directly over radio to American voters in language that they could understand about what he was doing. And by the way, supporting my thesis that financial reform was the heart and soul of the New Deal, his very first fireside chat, 8 days into the White House, was on the banking system.
Yeah.
He sat down and talked to the American public about the banking crisis, what was being done to address it, what they needed to do. If a bank reopened, you could trust that bank, he said. And you need to understand how banks work. And spoke to them, said, this is your problem as much as it's mine. Together, we can solve it.
Yeah.
And they did. So he used his bully pulpit to educate the people of his time about the policies that he was trying to put in place. That's a rare gift among politicians.
Ross Perot tried it, and it was rough for him.
That's
right.
That's true.
Here's the economy when the dollar's worth $1. I mean,
yeah.
Tell me about the SEC. When you compare what government does, is it grows. The legislative books and the legislative library gets bigger, not smaller. People go to Washington and say, well, there should be a law, and there should be a law. Talk about the SEC today, as opposed to what do you see the biggest evolution of that is? What is the difference, excuse me, between the SEC today and when it was originally
when it was
conceived?
born? It was born in June of 1934, so it's coming up on a big anniversary next year. It was conceived as the primary regulator of financial markets, financial activity. The Fed regulated banks, and the SEC regulated the rest of finance. Securities, bonds, brokers, people who sold oil royalty trusts, people who sold all sorts of crapola. And its initial mission was to enforce the existing securities laws, the new one that was adopted in the first 100 days under FDR, the Truth in Securities Laws. We call it the 33 Act. And it was very simple. It said you can't lie to people when you sell them securities. You've got to tell them the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth when you sell them securities. And that's the law. And it was originally going to be enforced by the Federal Trade Commission. The SEC didn't exist yet. So who's going to enforce this law? Well, the Federal Trade Commission was given that task to enforce that law. But Roosevelt had already decided before he came into office that the exchanges, the stock exchanges, had to be regulated. He'd said so in campaign speeches. And the struggle to create an engine that could regulate the stock exchanges took longer. It wasn't until 34 that bill got passed. But when it did, it envisioned an agency that would oversee the machinery of finance that interacted with the American public. That there would be somebody watching how those exchanges and brokers behaved and how they treated the American public. So it was seen as a watchdog that was going to wag its tail for the good guys and take a big bite out of the leg of the bad guys, and watch for what was happening. As time went by, and the early days of the SEC, which are what I focus on in this book, my book covers from 1929 to 1939, and that was really the birth pangs and the coming of age of the SEC as a regulator. In its original incarnation, it was seen as the primary enforcer of the rules of the road, of the rules that governed American finance. As decades went by, and more decades went by, and more decades went by, I've been sad to see the regulatory work become more and more fragmented among different regulators. We've got the CFTC, we've got the controller of the currency, we've got securities regulators and bank regulators in each of the 50 states. We've got FINRA out of the NASD history, and that legacy of a primary super regulator has been lost and broken. And
interesting.
I think one of the, well, if you were around for the 87 crash, I was too.
For sure.
And the book I wrote on the 87 crash, which was one of my favorites of my books, which authors shouldn't say, but it's called A First Class Catastrophe. And it was, it illustrated the degree to which this fragmented, balkanized regulatory system allowed the 87 crash to almost bring down the system. And it was a very near run thing. I mean, within minutes,
it was very quick.
There were transactions that if they not closed within 4 minutes, it would have shut down the commodity exchanges. So I mean, it was a dramatic, fast moving experience. In the aftermath of that crash, the Brady Commission, one of the best investigative commissions ever to look at Wall Street, led by Nicholas Brady. It looked at the events surrounding the 87 crash, and they said, look, one of the big problems that we've got to fix, they identified other things. One of the big problems, this balkanized, fragmented regulatory system. Nobody had a 360-degree view of what was going on, and we got to fix that.
We got to fix it. It reminded me actually of the, I don't know if they were balkanized, because I don't know that there was vitriol, but when the 9/11 attacks happened, the inability for interagency communication was highlighted, and I think that's maybe a stretch of a metaphor, but I think it captures the segmentation of everyone in their own domain instead of a single domain.
And as you said earlier so brilliantly, this wasn't designed.
This is evolved. Yeah.
This kind of fragmentation just evolved. Nobody said, oh, I think this will be a great way to regulate an economy or a great way to monitor our national defense. It just evolved. So fast forward to 2008, another financial crisis you and I both went through. In the aftermath of that, the research is done, Dodd-Frank is done, and out comes a report saying, wait a minute, the most serious problem, this is a report from a Republican Treasury, said the most serious problem here was the balkanized, fragmented regulatory system. We got to do something about that.
That's interesting. And
Steve Mnuchin, President Trump's Secretary of the Treasury, in his report on the capital markets, just 2 years into Trump's first term, said, we still have a serious problem with this balkanized, fragmented regulatory system. So we've known since at least 1987 that the way the system has evolved, that this grown like Topsy octopus that's kind of sprawling all over isn't working for us the way it did when we had a primary regulator centered in the SEC. And so there's lots of political excuses and lots of political history that explains why it's the way it is. But we come through the 2008 crisis. What do? We add a new regulator, FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council. So we don't consolidate oversight, we fragment it even more. So
That's
I
a
think
great insight.
one of the things that I hope people would take away from Taming the Street is that the legacy FDR wanted to give us, to hand down to us, was a watchdog on Wall Street, a cop on the street,
Mm-hmm.
as he called it. There would be a cop on the street. Well, imagine that we've got the kind of fragmentation you cited in the Defense Department. We've got a cop on the street, and then a Treasury agent on the street, and then a FBI guy on the street, and then we've got a Navy intelligence guy on the street, and we've got 15 guys on the street, and none of them know what the other one's doing, and nobody sees it as their primary responsibility to police the street. And so I'm hoping that we can move politically back towards a more centralized and consolidated approach to financial regulation. We should never have had to enact the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Products Commission. We should never have needed that, because that work should have been done by our existing machinery. And the fact that it hadn't been done, the impulse was, well, let's create somebody to do it, instead of let's go back to the people who should have done it and tell them, pull up your socks, get this job done. So I think part of the strength of the early SEC was its power in the federal bureaucracy, its primacy in the regulatory bureaucracy, and that was a big part of how it was able to be so effective.
Why does I mean, maybe this is a bad question, but to me, I get frustrated at I'm not a political guy. I don't like to get involved in the politics because I'm just trying to make it happen for my own family. But I look at, like, why aren't books like yours read? Why is there apathy in the electorate towards these things? Why is there not an energy for people to learn more, so they understand things like the SEC, they understand things like the Fed? How does a book like yours help? If I'm just an average citizen, why should I read this? Why should I care? Because I get incensed by the apathy of the public towards this topic. It drives me crazy. Maybe you can solve that.
Well, here's what I've tried to do. I've tried to tuck this history lesson inside the juiciest, most exciting story of human political struggle you've ever seen.
Yeah.
And with larger than life characters,
and
dramatic scenes that unfold and carry the reader along. I'm trying to make this a history pill that will go down very easy. Edutainment in the best sense of the word. And I'm pleased to say that the reviews that the book has gotten so far, Andy, have all cited that it is riveting and rollicking, and it races along and holds your attention. So I think that's part of the responsibility. Frankly, a lot of us who care about financial history and who care about educating the public about financial justice have to take a stern look in the mirror and say, have you made this fun? Have you made this entertaining? Have you made this seem important?
Interesting.
And
two things.
So I think that's necessary.
There's two things I have to get in, and then I'll let you go. You've been overly gracious with your time. If you get two people that care about history, time flies pretty quick. Regulation is let's use this metaphor. You plug a hole and they drill another one, and you plug a hole and they drill another one. You plug a hole. In other words, the greed motive, the profit motive, is you lay the rules out, and then the people that have to obey those rules say, all right, how do we circumnavigate these rules without breaking them? And so then they get another round and another round, and there's this cat and mouse game. So what I think is interesting is you have two things that they're coming on the scene at the same time. One is crypto and the other's AI.
Yeah.
Because if I can use AI now, so do I have to use AI to write my laws and AI to circumvent those laws? Do we have to make this a chess game between regulatory AI and investing,
let's call it loophole AI.
Yeah, loophole. Yeah, that's
loophole
beautiful.
AI.
Yeah, loophole AI
and regulatory
That's
AI.
to me, I think that's a fascinating question. Then you insert a currency that is, whatever crypto is. That's a fascinating dynamic that
It is.
FDR probably never saw coming.
Well, no, I know, but if you think about it, the world of crypto right now is what Wall Street was in the 1920s.
Yeah, it's almost like the bucket shops, right?
Right, unregulated,
yeah.
a few big giant whales, easily manipulated, false
fraught
disclosure,
fraught with
fraud and lies and suspect people. Well, welcome to Coolidge's Wall Street. I mean, that was what Wall Street was like before the regulations of the New Deal. And so I look at that and say, it's the best lesson, frankly, Andy, I could have for younger readers to say, you know what crypto's like right now? You know how you lost that money and you know how your friends lost. Well, that's what it was all like before we had federal regulation of Wall Street. And that's why regulation is worth defending. I'm reminded of that Joni Mitchell song, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And I worry that we have come to take the protections of the New Deal rulebook, Roosevelt's rulebook, so much for granted that we don't value it anymore. And we listen to politicians say, oh, deregulate, deregulate, deregulate. And we say, oh, okay, that sounds good to me, because you don't really understand that you've lived your whole life under the protection of Roosevelt's rules without even realizing it. But with crypto, it's one of those aha moments. It's like, okay, here's an unregulated market. How's that working out?
Yeah.
How's that working for you? You feel real confident investing in crypto without any regulation? Whoa, no, I don't really. Well, maybe don't give up the regulation we've already got in the rest of our financial sectors. So I tried in a way to make a case for intelligent regulation, wise regulation, to help readers see how they personally benefit from that, so that they're not so quick to fall for, the political knee-jerk, oh, let's get rid of all these rules, let's get rid of all these regulations. That seems to be a political posture that never goes away in Washington. I don't know what its endless charm is, because, frankly, are you ready to give up the FDIC? We had a series of bank failures late last fall. How did that turn out? Well, let me tell you what we didn't have last fall when we had Silicon Valley Bank fail and Signature Bank. We didn't have a nationwide bank run that closed every bank in the country.
Yeah,
that's what we had in 1933 before the FDIC.
I look at the principles of those laws. If you take a Series 65 or Series 7, it's actually most of the questions they'll ask you if you're going to cite law are those in the 30s. They're those acts of the 30s that were put in that still stand on principle of, I think you captured it well in saying, we'll tell the truth. I mean, that's a principle. No matter how much AI we get, we've got to tell people the truth.
Tell people and with your own area of expertise in 401ks as the popular savings and retirement medium that they have become, would have been a shadow of that absent a well-regulated mutual fund industry in the U.S.
Had it done well, there wouldn't have been a 401k. There would have been a group of smart men and women that would have said, let's design something for the employee rather than the advantage of corporations, Wall Street, and government. Of the four partners, this is why people should read your book.
And yours.
If you, I'll leave with this thought, and I'm always the advocate for learning more. No matter what regulation they put out there, I've still got to learn to lock my door. It's against the law to come in my home and steal my things. But ultimately, as a human being, I have to learn to lock my door. And the smarter you are, as much as we would like to have this beautiful balance between, capitalism pursuit and to watchdog the bad players, there is no government program that can substitute, doesn't have the horsepower to overcome a lack of personal financial education, I'd encourage you to read everything you can on history, and for sure, pick up Taming the Street, The Old Guard, The New Deal, FDR's fight to regulate American capitalism, and drop by www.Diana B. Henriques and check out what she has to say. You have been just delightful to talk to and with, and you've captured some wonderful. My favorite part of our conversation was, I did not realize I didn't see the fragmentation problem until you pointed it out, and that is a huge deal. So there's just great stuff.
When you read Taming the Street, you'll see that how it started out, as a unified primary regulator, and then sort of how it's turned out. And we need to do better. But you've been a wonderful host, Andy.
Well,
thanks. It's wonderful to talk with someone who shares my passion for history. And I've enjoyed it so much.
Well, hang on just for one more minute after I close the show so I can properly give you my gratitude and thanks. You've been listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast. We do our very best to make investing simple, and this time history interesting. So we hope you enjoyed the conversation, that gave you food for thought, and mostly that you'll take action by learning more every single week. We want to learn more every week, get smarter. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner. For more information on investing made easy, go to thecashflowacademy.com.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.